Well, good morning and welcome to our latest episode of Trade Talks. I'm joined as ever by our two doctors, Rebecca Harding and Dr. Jack Harding from Coriolis Technologies. Quite a busy week to reflect upon, most notably in Alaska between the US and China. Rebecca, I'll start with you. What were your reflections on what happened?
Uh, so it was quite extraordinary. We weren't expecting much from the conversations, but let's just say all diplomatic gloves were off. They seemed to be firing rhetorical broadsides at each other. Let's just say it wasn't a presidential meeting. It was the Secretaries of States, the Foreign Office, and the Defence side of things meeting. So it was really to set the tone for how US-China relations were going to develop. And what was quite clear, the US laid out their concerns, same concerns as under Donald Trump, but particularly sharpened by Hong Kong, the Uyghurs and human rights, of course, but also incursions in the Taiwan Strait, the coercive strategy towards Australia and China's trade with Australia, and obviously Japan as well. So US had a lot of concerns. China walloped the ball back again and said, well, actually, we believe that we're never going to invade another country, but you're invading our national security by having the approach that you have. And this is domestic for us and it's nothing to do with you. So it started things off on a very bad footing.
Jack, what was your analysis of it all?
Yeah, well, I mean, very similar to that of Rebecca. I mean, I think it was described as undiplomatic, the meeting. So definitely an explosive start to proceedings between the United States and China. The interesting thing is you have to look at this from different cultural perspectives. So the United States still adopts a mentality where it sees military build-up and a lot of the actions that China has taken as being potentially expansionist, at least if not in geographic or physical terms, and definitely perhaps in cyberspace and in the trade space, and perhaps you might even say in a sort of cognitive sense as well. They're actually trying to expand into areas that maybe the United States has seen itself as being more autonomous in. So the interesting thing here is, from the Chinese perspective, things like military buildup, they don't necessarily believe that they have the intent to use these military capabilities, but from a Western perspective, it still comes across as very threatening. So what you had is two sides that essentially is a clash of cultures. And it's the difficulty, I think, is going to be reconciling those two differences, because they're at fundamentally different ends of the spectrum, and finding that middle ground that I think before Biden came in, and Antony Blinken as well, maybe there were some hopes for something slightly more, let's say, good-natured, but it seems like it's going to be a sort of rocky road ahead.
Rebecca, I sort of just got accustomed to hearing Five Eyes and understanding who was part of that, but all of a sudden we're hearing about the Quad. So who is it and what do they do?
It's an effort to exclude China by India, Japan, Australia and the United States. So it's a grouping of those four countries to isolate China's interests largely in the Indo Pacific region. So why those countries? Because, as I said before, this is actually the United States trying to align interests around the South China Seas and the whole area around Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. So it's an alliance of countries that have a very strong trade interest and a very strong military interest in that particular region. And it's just to start the process of creating almost a Western alliance against Chinese interests, and a lot of US policy is going to go through that. Interestingly, the UK is not part of that, and the pivot to Indochina is going to be a big thing for the UK government as well. But the UK is not part, so, and New Zealand isn't part, so it's not Five Eyes anymore. It's the Quad.
And so we are seeing a greater focus on the Indo Pacific region, and Jack, do you see that as an attempt to, we discussed about the Quad as a means of isolating China, and is there, are there any opportunities for the US and China to work together on the world stage?
Yeah, well, I think working together is going to be fundamental to any approach taken towards China. And actually, that's also reflected in the United Kingdom's recent integrated review, where you have this interesting dichotomy between actually competing with China and also cooperating with China. And I think that's going to be reflected also in the United States' strategy towards China. You have this very, very interesting position that you find a lot of those, particularly Western states, in, where they're slightly threatened by the rise of China, particularly their capabilities and possibly their intent as well. But also because of the fact that everything is sort of intertwined, interrelated in the modern era. You have no way of avoiding also cooperating with China. So finding that middle ground, finding a way to actually move forward constructively is going to be something that needs doing.
And if I could maybe come in on that, because Jack's absolutely right, this is a different form of relationships and foreign policy that's beginning to evolve, that we're seeing in this pivot to Indochina. So in one sense, it's about isolating things that are seen as a security threat, but it's also developing cooperation. I think the big area where this is going to happen is in sustainability. So in actual fact, in US-China relations, the thing that really needs to be thrashed out is actually around sustainability, because it's a top of a list of priorities for President Biden and his administration. It's top of a list of priorities in China, and obviously it's top of a list of priorities for the UK and the EU as well. So I think that's a big area, because China thinks in terms of the long game, right? So we're not thinking about strategy in 5 years' time, we're thinking about strategy in 500 years' time for China. China wants to make sure there is a planet. Everybody wants to make sure there is a planet in 500 years' time. So sustainability is going to be the big area of cooperation, I think.
Now, the one thing we haven't discussed, interestingly, in a forum called Trade Talks is trade itself. So what are your reflections on that particular point, on what emerged from this meeting? Was it positive, or are we all indifferent to what was said?
So I think trade is underpinning, and Jack would corroborate this exactly. Trade underpins everything that happens in the South China Sea, because around 30% of world trade goes through the South China Sea. Japan and the Senkaku Islands and China, we saw trade relations break down a few years ago. But the important thing in terms of the meeting is that we're not seeing any major shift in the Trump tariffs towards China. We're not likely to see Biden actually unwind those tariffs. He might make some agreements at the edges, but it's not going to be very big changes in terms of Trump's overall trade policy. And it hasn't made that much difference to US-China trade. China still exports roughly 3 times the amount to the US that it imports from the US. So this is where part of the strategic competition is, and that's going to stay.
And it's approaching 100 days of the Biden presidency, Rebecca. Hasn't been too much in terms of foreign policy. There an interesting interjection this week on President Putin in Russia. What would be your main assessments over the first 3 months?
Quiet, assertive, fairly lucky, because a lot of the things that happened, that have happened with, say, COVID, were in place before Biden came to power. But I think the most important thing is he's just taken very firm hands on the domestic and the foreign policy tiller, and he's just making sure that everybody knows that he's quiet, he's confident, and he's going to assert American interests in a very similar way to Trump, but just not as noisy. It's taken foreign policy off the front pages.
And Jack, closer to home, you mentioned it earlier, but this long-awaited report from the UK government, written by Professor John Bew at King's College London. Could you give us a synopsis of what the top lines were? And be interesting to get your thoughts if there was anything that was missing, and what your takeaways were.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that jumps off the page immediately is this notion of sovereignty. So I actually did a very quick sort of frequency analysis comparing the Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2015 versus the Integrated Review. And in the previous one, the 2015 version, you had 4 mentions of the idea of autonomy or sovereignty, and that's versus 15 in the integrated review. So sovereignty is now the #1 interest. It's ranked #1 in the integrated review. Then you have prosperity, and you also have protection of the people as well. So that is going to be the fundamental objective of the United Kingdom going forward. So that for me is the in the sort of post-Brexit environment, that's the thing that is going to be prioritised in the United Kingdom. It's the preservation of sovereignty, and it's taking autonomous decisions in the foreign policy space as well.
Rebecca, any reflections from you? I think what was interesting about Global Britain in a competitive era was the name. This is about, as Jack said, sovereignty, but it's also about competitiveness and trade competitiveness. So you've got, again, laid out in very stark terms the issue of, well, Britain is a sovereign nation. We are a coastal nation. We are going to defend our rights to be an independent trading nation and a nation with our own foreign policy. But also this intrinsic conflict now between needing to expand, needing to trade with China in particular, and therefore have a strategy in the Indo Pacific, but also the need to maintain our security. So there is an intrinsic almost not paradox, but a conflict between those two positions. But it's almost an example of the conflict in foreign policy and the conflict in trade policy that the US faces as well. And I think that's the interesting point about it, that there's this kind of dichotomy there. We'll have to leave it there. Jack, Rebecca, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.